Sure is interesting connecting with beekeepers from all over. I guess I didn't really realize the extent on how scared beekeepers are with the act of robbing. I take robbing very seriously. I try to think maybe I understand its behavior, and by understanding the behavior, maybe I don't fear it as much, and maybe along the same lines of thought, just because I see it a certain way. Maybe I'm managing my bees in a certain way where I don't really feel robbing's an issue for me. Robbing is a very natural behavior for the honeybees and very necessary. I see robbing as being nature's way of calling out the herd in a sense. The hives, they get really aggressive and scouring the area for all the sugar resource they can find. The honeybee hive acts as a social organism, so the collective needs to be able to get through the dearth of winter, which is a very long period of time. And to be able to get that social unit through winter, their strategy is to store and hoard honey, which they consume to be able to get them through this period of dearth. So in late summer, fall, they get really aggressive because they sense winter coming and they want to hoard all the honey for themselves. And what they'll do is they'll go and they will attack the smaller units, strip those units of all its resource and bring it back into their own unit. And I find it very interesting, this strategy, because at the same time, while they're robbing out all this resource, they bring back all the problems from that hive too. And it's a very effective way for disease to spread itself all throughout your apiary. I find robbing not to be as big of an issue for me. I do have the bee pressure, like I keep yards of 40 within a mile and a half. Like that's my area. On a grid system, I have a yard every mile and a half. And I have neighbors all around me, so I have a lot of bee pressure. Just I do a few things to kind of, I guess, prevent robbing from happening. First off, it's identifying the weak and the dying hives before they get to the point of not being able to defend themselves. So I identify all those hives with my assessments and I remove those hives from the yards before it gets to the point where they can't defend the hive anymore. I also, during the late summer into fall, I will reduce the entrance on the hives just to provide a smaller space for those bees to have to defend. So that helps them out quite a lot. I'm pretty liberal in the fall with my feeding, so I make sure that they have an adequate amount of feed in that hive so they're not in a panic mode all the time. So that's really important too. I get a tremendous amount of feedback from guys telling me that their hives have died from robbing. And I understand what they mean, but I think they got things mixed up a little bit. The hive probably didn't die from robbing. The hive probably died and then got robbed out, which killed off the last of them, right? So the hive was probably weak and dying and couldn't defend itself anymore. And the robbing bees came in, cleaned out the resource, left nothing for the remainder of the bees in that colony, and then that hive just perished. I do have experience with robbing frenzy, and you have to be careful. You have to understand the bees' behavior to be able to avoid these frenzies. Because I keep my hives in a higher density apiary, there's bee yards all around. There's bee yards within flight distance to that other yard of mine. So you have to be careful on the work you do during dearths. One disastrous experience I had with robbing, which is a good experience for me, was I like to call out my weaker hives, my smaller units, and I bring them to a separate yard. I call it my nursery. In this nursery yard, I try to, set aside from the rest of the apiary, at least 2 miles away from any other hives around. But this one particular year, this nursery I kept was within a mile of this other bee yard, which was in good shape. So this nursery was maybe a little bit too close to a production yard. And I went in, and they were in nukes at that time. I'd taken them down into smaller units just to help them build. And the hives were doing fairly well, to the point where I had to transfer them into larger equipment. And this was during my June dearth. I decided to transfer them up into single boxes, and there weren't really big layer, maybe 2 frames of brood, maybe 3, and some bees enough to keep that unit going. But they're moving forward. They're in pretty good shape. So I transferred, it was a yard of 30 or 40. So we transferred those nukes into single boxes. And it took us maybe a little bit longer than we thought it would. But by transferring them into the single boxes, there was exposed honey from the units that we had set out to be transferred into, and by opening up the nukes. And we transferred them into the new boxes, closed everything up, and by the time we were done that yard, that whole yard was in a robbing frenzy. The bees were coming from this external production yard, coming into this yard and robbing out these new units we just fixed up. And these units weren't defending themselves. And I figure by transferring that unit that was in its familiar smelling box into this new box, which the smells were a little bit different, they were in a new house, they weren't defending themselves in that new box. And that allowed the robbers to come in and just start stripping the resources from these boxes. And these little hives were just sitting there clustered over their brood, almost like they're petrified, like terrified, just holding themselves, just maintaining that brood nest while they allowed the whole nest to be robbed out. I thought that was one of the most interesting things I have ever seen. I've never seen robbing to that degree before, and I've never seen bees behave that way before either. So we took these units and we actually picked them up and moved them to a new yard right the hell away from everything else. And these hives were able to regain themselves, and I think they adjusted to their new surrounding. Then after a day or two, they acted in that box as their hive again. And there's guard bees, and they're carrying on with normal colony function. So I moved those hives back into that nursery yard again, and we had 0 robbing issues. But those hives were settled into that box, familiar with their home and defending themselves again. So instances like that, if we understand why bees rob, we understand the mechanism around that hive defending its unit from the robbers. If we just do a few things to help avoid robbing as the issue, then robbing should not be a concern to us at all. I get a lot of guys asking me, by open feeding in the yard like I do, how I'm not creating a robbing frenzy. Well, I'm not creating a robbing frenzy because every unit in that yard is capable of defending its unit. I could put that tote of sugar on top of a beehive within that yard, and there would be active foraging, rob feeding out of that tote, but the hive underneath would be absolutely fine because the hive is carrying on normal function and defending its nest. I'll get hives that die off and I'll miss them and I'll come back to a robbed out unit, but it's robbed right out, but the unit beside it is absolutely fine because that unit beside it has been able to fend off all those robbers, whereas all those robber bees go into that neighboring hive and strip it of its resource. I used to blow bees and use fumes to pull honey. We'd be working in a yard, and it seems like that 35-minute mark was the magic number where the bees would go out, recognize the food's being stripped off, come back, tell a hive, and before you knew it, 35 minutes later, the whole yard is a robbing frenzy. Well, we'd be in a yard for an hour. I remember one time it just took forever, and we're in a yard for an hour and a half. The whole yard was a bloody cloud of bees as they're stripping off these boxes of honey. It was just terrible. But we were caught in an unfortunate situation, and we couldn't keep the bees from staying out of the boxes we were trying to strip off. But that robbing frenzy that created, as soon as we left, those bees went back to their nests. They may be a little more defensive, but that robbing frenzy didn't continue on robbing every one of those hives out in that yard. They went back to their home. Their defenses were up. They were a little bit grumpy, but they carried on their normal colony function. So don't be afraid of robbing. When you see robbing happening, maybe try to understand what's actually going on. Is it the nest is failing? Is the hive dying off? Maybe there's a hive manipulation you did earlier, which created the robbing frenzy and that nest couldn't defend himself. There's always a reason around why the hives get robbed out. So I hope that little bit of feedback helped. You'll see as we go, I'll be talking about it more. But don't be afraid of robbing, and just try to understand it if you ever run into it.